I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, my colleague Janani Ramanathan, who's a senior researcher at the Mother Service Society. She's also a director on the board of the World University Consortium and a member of the board of the World Academy of Art and Science and a trustee with a fascinating background. She's in the middle of writing a book on English literature and what we can learn from literature about social development and social change and change of consciousness. She's doing management consulting. She's doing research on history and working on an important project at the global level on the future of education. Janani, I turn it over to you.
If you happen to look very closely at a large painting, you can see the individual brush strokes and the patches of different colors, but it's not easy to identify the picture that's painted or appreciate the beauty of the work of art from close. You need to move back some. It's the same with history. On the surface, we see numerous events, some concurrent, some sequential, more seem to be in some random order. On the surface of it, history does not reveal what direction it's taking or how the momentum is generated, what generates it. But look beneath the surface and we see that history has a clear direction. Some changes are apparent. We see advances in technology, all of us from all over the world here talking together. We see changes in social norms, growth of knowledge, exponential growth of information, and so on. But all these are external appearances of something deeper that is driving the change. And that is a change in consciousness. Sri Aurobindo, the great intellectual Gary just mentioned now, said that psychological evolution of consciousness must precede social evolution of forms. So if we want to understand where we're going, we need to understand this change in consciousness. Then behind the events that unfold around us and the news that we read every day, the main lines of social evolution become visible, and these lines paint a picture of hope for the future. One clear movement we see is the shift from small, isolated, culturally homogeneous communities to heterogeneous, multicultural groups, giving rise to an increasingly interconnected and interdependent global community. The effort the world is taking collectively to handle this COVID-19 pandemic has never been taken before in the past. Even during the world wars, countries were on one of two opposing sides. Today, we see every country cooperating, coordinating efforts, assisting each other. How many times in this 1 year have we heard the words, no one is safe until everyone is safe? COVAX, the global initiative that coordinates international resources to enable equitable access to the vaccines and to treatment, is one case in point. 60% of the human population is covered by COVAX. We see the same collective consciousness at work in tackling climate change, which we recognize as a common global problem now. Another pattern clearly visible is this shift from settling disputes by the use of violent physical force to peace negotiations and a global rule of law to a very large extent. The percentage of people who are victims of violence and war has fallen with every century. In the 75 years since the end of World War II, large-scale warring among the world's leading powers has ceased, a first in the history of civilization. Even a single act of violence, arrest of one dissident or the murder of one journalist becomes global news because social consciousness is awake more than before. News of violence is jarring today because we are more sensitized than before, not that violence in society is worse than before. Physical security and wealth generation are giving ways to ideas of human welfare. For the first time in history, the nations of the world have unanimously agreed on a common set of 17 sustainable goals to promote the well-being of all. Values are becoming more internalized. We no longer need legislation or the compulsion from an external authority to force us to follow a law, to adopt a habit. After the US, under the previous administration, announced its withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, more than half the US states joined the US Climate Alliance, affirming their commitment to the same goals of the Paris Agreement. Cities, businesses, universities representing 120 million Americans made similar commitments. Clearly, we no longer wait for no authority to compel us. The value and centrality of human capital is replacing the value of financial capital. The value that we place on education is an indication. Education was for the privileged classes. The UN Millennium Development Goals have made universal primary education a reality for 91% of world's children. The quality education for all is one of the sustainable development goals. The World Academy, along with the World University Consortium, has envisioned a system of education delivery that can provide world class higher education that is accessible and affordable to everyone, everywhere in the world. Earlier, rights and powers were accorded exclusively or disproportionately to the elite. Today, we see universal human rights and more equitable distribution of all forms of social power. When the American Declaration of Independence said that all men are equal, it meant only men, not women. Slaves still existed. African Americans could not vote till 100 years later. Women could not vote till 1920. Today, we the people are growing stronger. Every day, civil society organizations, they're becoming more and more, heard. In 2011, a Canadian magazine with a circulation of 70,000 issued a call to its readers to occupy Wall Street, little expecting that 2,000 activists, students would respond. They would march through downtown Manhattan and occupy a park nearby for 2 months. During the next 2 years, it led to nearly 1,000 Occupy events in 82 countries around the world. The movement has had an impact on global politics. It focused public attention on issues such as inequality, control of the financial sector, and generally on civil society activism. It opened up the political space for other actors to press for reform and legislation. If one magazine can initiate a global movement of change, imagine the power that resides in the 10 million NGOs and the civil society organizations we have today. 80% of global citizens agree that NGOs make it easy to be involved in social change. And by 2030, the number of people who support and donate to NGOs is expected to touch 2.5 billion. Where we were silent or seemed to be blind before, we now speak up, as we see in the Me Too movement worldwide. Black Lives Matter, it began in 2013 as a decentralized social movement. By 2020, 67% of all adult Americans expressed some support for it. The movement received support even in countries without a sizable community of people of African origin. This change was not caused by one event alone. It was not due to George Floyd or the video of the incident that was shared worldwide. They all had a role, but there is a greater truth. What is driving this change is a change in our consciousness and values. Our very idea of values, such as freedom, have changed. We talked about freedom in the 15th century, we talked about it in the 20th. But what we mean by freedom today is different from what we meant by the same word earlier. Our commitment to the value has evolved, become more sensitive, inclusive, and perhaps the most powerful and important sign of a positive change is seen in our youth. The youth are driving a change today. Uh, Hazel Henderson's comment, I just happened to read it now. She had mentioned this. The youth, they represent the most environmentally conscious, concerned, and committed community on earth. As an 8-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg wondered why adults were not taking any action to stop climate change. One day in 2018, she protested outside the Swedish parliament alone. The next day, she was joined by other people who had seen her photos in the media. Greta repeated this every Friday, and Fridays for the Future movement was born. Within a year, it had spread to 163 countries. Today, she has 5 million followers on Twitter. She was the Times 2019 Person of the Year, the youngest to be chosen in over 90 years. And she's one of the most powerful voices on climate change now at the age of 18. Her impact is called the Greta effect. Millennials are the most socially active generation. They are demanding and they are working for a different world. They fight constructively out of aspiration to protect the environment, to seek peace, for the right to education. And they are the most networked generation in history. They're connected with almost the entire world. Technology is merely the instrument. The force, the driving force is a change within. I'll conclude by mentioning just one value that we see distinctly emerging today: individuality. Not the self centered, competitive individualism, but the recognition of the uniqueness and the sacredness of each individual. This is the right that is embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The formed individual is the source of all social innovation and creativity. All significant change in human history has been the result of action by one or a small group of formed individuals. If Greta Thunberg or Malala Yousafzai can create global awareness on critical issues and set off worldwide movements, how much more is possible with all the strong, dynamic, creative, young, and committed individuals we have? Such individuality holds out great hope for all of us, because that is the essence of spirituality, that each person is divine. Thank you.
Thank you, Janani, for going much deeper into the issue and getting some very interesting feedback from the questions as you were going through.